Masechet Ḥullin Daf Yod Dalid. A few lines up on the previous Amud, we read, Be'amine Rav Achteboy bar Ameh merav. Rav Achteboy, the son of Ameh, asked the following question to Rav. Hamevashel b'chalev gedi shelo hinika mahu. If someone cooks meat in milk from a pregnant goat that has not yet nursed, it's still pregnant, has not given birth yet, and therefore that goat is not yet a mother. And the pasuk says, "Lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo," in the milk of its mother. But this milk came out of the goat before it actually gave birth. It already starts producing milk shortly before it gives birth, and so is that considered milk? Amar le, mid istericha lishmuel memar b'chalev imol velo b'chalev zachar, zachar hu delate lichlal em aval hai kevan deba lichlal em asur. And Rav answered, since Shemuel taught us that the reason why the pasuk says the milk of its mother comes to include and not milk that comes from a male animal. So milk from a female animal, yes, is prohibited to cook with meat, but if a male should produce some kind of liquid, some kind of milk, it will not be prohibited to cook with meat. And so therefore, a male that will never become a mother, its milk is permitted to cook with meat. However, this pregnant goat, or any pregnant animal that is going to become a mother, is prohibited. So it doesn't matter that it's not yet a mother because it didn't give birth. If it's producing milk, then that milk is prohibited because it will soon become a mother. Itmar, hamabashel chaleb behalav. Rabbi Ameh v'Rabbi Aseh. Had amar lokeh v'had amar eno lokeh. If someone cooks forbidden fat, chaleb, with milk, similar words, chaleb and halab. So chaleb is part of the meat of the animal, and so therefore it is considered meat. It also has its own prohibition of forbidden fat, and you're cooking it with milk. So Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh have a machloket. One says he will get a malkut, he will get lashes for meat and milk, besides the prohibition of eating chaleb, and the other says no, he only violates eating chaleb, which is a serious prohibition, and does not violate meat and milk. Lema behakami palge. We'll see a few different interpretations about what is at the essence of their controversy. Deman amar loke kasabar isur hal al isur. Man amar eno loke kasabar en isur hal al isur. So let's explain it as follows: that the one who says he does get lashes follows the opinion that says you can have one prohibition that applies to another. The chaleb was already prohibited from the time that this animal was formed, and then when you take that chaleb and cook it in halav, now you have another prohibition, and yes, a prohibition can apply to another, so you get both punishments. And the other opinion says no, since it was already prohibited as chaleb, we're not going to have a second prohibition that will apply to it, and therefore no lashes for eating meat and milk. La dekula alma en isur hal al isur achila dekula alma la pelige de la ke pelige abishul. Manda mar loke had isurahu, umanda mar eno loke lahachi apekar chamana lachila b'shon bishul kevan de al achila la lake abishul nami la lake. And now we say no, not necessarily do we have to say that they're arguing whether isur hal al isur or not, but rather we can explain that everybody agrees en isur hal al isur. And therefore, regarding eating, everybody agrees that he will not get any lashes, since the fat, forbidden fat, chaleb, was already prohibited to be eaten. Therefore, no second prohibition of eating can apply to it, and therefore everybody agrees when we say he gets lashes, it's not for eating it. Rather, the question is, what if he just cooks it? You're allowed to cook chaleb. There's no prohibition on cooking chaleb. And now, so he cooks chaleb and halav. So the question is, will he get lashes for cooking meat and milk? The one who says yes, he gets lashes, thinks that cooking meat and milk together is its own prohibition. That's separate from eating it. And therefore, since he cooked meat, the chaleb is part of the meat of the animal, and milk, so he violates. And this is independent from eating. Now, he wouldn't violate eating, but eating is separate from cooking meat and milk, and therefore, yes, he will violate cooking meat and milk, and he gets lashes for cooking meat and milk because it has nothing to do with eating, and there's no doesn't violate eating chalib because he didn't eat it, and there's no violation for cooking chalib. There's no problem with that. So yes, he gets malkut. And the other opinion that says he does not get lashes for cooking chalib and halab will explain that the Torah used the word bishul to describe eating. 3 times the Torah says, do not eat, do not cook, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. And we apply one of those to mean cooking, one to eating, and one to deriving benefit. Well, why does it say eating and in the language of cooking? Why not say lo tochal gedi b'chalev imo? Why use the verb cooking if really you mean eating? And so that opinion will say, oh, this is why the Hamana, the Torah, Hashem in the Torah, described eating using a verb cooking to teach us that since in any case where one does not violate eating, one will also not be liable for cooking. And therefore in this case, since the chalib is already prohibited for eating, therefore if you cook the chalib in halav, there's no additional prohibition of eating because en isur hal al isur. And the prohibition of eating and the prohibition of cooking are connected together. That's why the Torah calls eating cooking, so that if you would not violate by eating, you also do not violate cooking, so there's no violation for cooking chalib and halab together. That's all one possibility. And another interpretation, another version of this discussion says that when it comes to cooking, everybody agrees that you will get lashes because there's no prohibition of cooking chalib, so this is the first cooking prohibition that applies to this food. And therefore, yes, if you cook chalib and halab, you definitely get lashes. That's no machloket about that. Ki pelige achila, the controversy is about eating chalib and halab that you cook together. The opinion that says that one does not get lashes will say, well, a second prohibition cannot apply to a first. The chalib is already prohibited to eat, and so therefore there's no additional prohibition for eating it, cooking and eating it with milk. And the opinion that says he does get lashes for eating the chalib and halav that was cooked together says that this is why the Torah used the word for bishul to describe eating in order to teach me that since you are liable for cooking them together, you are also liable for eating them together. In other words, this opinion will say that in general, en isur hal al isur. However, here, the first prohibition is only on eating the chalib. And the second prohibition, well, by cooking them together, you violate chalib and halav. And they are connected so that since you're liable for cooking it together, yes, you are, even if you're not the one that cooked it, let's say someone else cooked it together, they'll be liable to lashes. You come along and you eat the chalib and halab that were cooked together, that person also gets lashes since one would be liable for cooking it together, and it says the word instead of eating, it says the word cooking to describe eating. That teaches us that even if you're just eating, you get the same punishment as if you cooked the chalib and halab together. And another answer, we never figured out who said which one, but one said one and one said the other case, and they are not arguing. The one opinion that said that you do get lashes was talking about if someone cooks them together, then you get lashes, because there was no prior prohibition of cooking. And the other opinion that says that you do not get lashes was describing eating, because there is already a prohibition of eating, and en isur hal al isur. According to this last version, both Rabbi and Rabbi Aseh agree that en isur hal al isur, so they agree that there's no additional prohibition for eating, but there is a prohibition for cooking it, because there was no prohibition for cooking the chalib by itself. We're going to challenge this possibility that Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh both say and Isur Hal al Isur from a Tosefta that teaches Hamabashel B'meh Halav Patur. If someone cooks meat in, it's called water of milk, it means whey. That's the left after the milk curdles. You have the liquidy stuff is called whey, and whey with meat, cooking it together, patur is not liable because that's not called milk. Dam shebishelo b'halav patur, as we learned already before, cooking blood and milk together is not liable because blood is not meat. If someone cooks bones and tendons, horns, hooves, all things that are not edible parts of the animal with milk, he is exempt because this is not called the meat of the animal. However, if you have sacrificial meat that became pigul, one hasn't had intention to consume it outside the time, or notar, one actually left it past the time, or it's sacrificial meat that's tameh, all these things one is not allowed to eat. There's already a prohibition, and these are made out of meat. If you would cook any of these types of meat with milk, one is liable. Why is one liable? Since it's already prohibited as pigul, notar, or tameh, one is not allowed to eat any of these types of sacrificial meat. So why do you get also lashes for eating this food as basar b'chalav? So this must be that this baraita thinks that Isur Halal Isur, we do apply a second prohibition on top of a previous one. If a Baraita says that Isur Halal Isur, how can Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh both say and Isur Halal Isur? And the answer is Haytana Sabar Isur Halal Isur. Yeah, this Baraita thinks that Isur Halal Isur, but Rabbi and Rabbi Aseh can follow the other Tana that says and Isur Halal Isur, and so there is no problem there. Hamabashir b'meh halav patur. We return to the baraita that says if someone cooks meat and whey, then they are not liable. Mesayah le Resh Lakish. This baraita supports the statement of Resh Lakish. He said a statement about a Mishnah in Masechet Machshirin that teaches Ditnan me halab harehu kehalab vehamochal harehu keshemen, that water of milk, meaning whey, is the same as milk, and the watery substance that comes out of olives when you put olives in a vat is like oil. Even though it's not technically oil, it's more watery. It has the same law as oil. Now, on the face of it, this would not be the same as the baraita, because the baraita said that whey and meat, one is not liable, so that whey is not like milk. And here it says that whey is like milk. However, here's where Resh Lakish comes in. Amar Resh Lakish, lo shanu ela lachshir et hazera'im, aval inyan bishul basar b'chalab, me'chalab eno kehalab. It said this Mishnah is only talking about machshirin, liquids that make something susceptible to tumah. And milk is one of those liquids, and so is oil. And the Mishnah is coming to teach us that whey, although it's more watery, the watery part of the milk, nevertheless, that will, if it falls on fruit, then it will make the fruit susceptible to tumah. And so also the more watery substance that comes out of olives is like oil, and also will make something mukhshar letumah. However, when it comes to eating, cooking meat and milk, mehalab, whey, is not like milk, and therefore cooking meat in whey is not liable. Teno Rabanan b'halev imo en li ela b'halev imo b'halev para v'rachel minayin. Braita T asks, when it says lo tavishal gedi b'halev imo, so it means in a goat's its mother's milk. So I understand. I'll expand this to goat's milk. But how do I know that one is prohibited from cooking goat meat in milk from a cow or milk from a sheep? Amarta, kal vachomer, uma imo shelo ne'esra imo beharba'a ne'esra imo bebishul. So we can learn this from a kal vachomer. If regarding its mother, where there is no prohibition of mating, you could take two goats and mate them together. There's no laws of incest when it comes to animals. So the child and its mother, or whatever, any two goats, you're permitted to mate together, and yet one is prohibited from cooking meat from a goat and milk from a goat. Then goat meat with cow milk, or goat meat with sheep milk. Well, when you have a goat and a cow, or a goat and a sheep, there is a prohibition of mating them together because they're different species. And so, since they are now more prohibited from each other, since you're not allowed to mate them together, all the more so, one will not be allowed to cook them together. In other words, if a goat and a goat, you're allowed to mate together, and yet goat meat and goat milk you're not allowed to cook, then goat and a different species, which you're not even allowed to mate together, so it's more stringent, all the more so you would not be allowed to cook goat meat with milk from these other two species. So the use actually is a kavachomer. Talmud lomar b'chalev imo, and therefore it teaches in its mother's milk. It says it a second time to include other species. Now we wonder, Veha lama li kira. It's for strange baraita. It proved it from a kavachomer that it's prohibited, and then brought a pasuk to also say it's prohibited. Well, I don't need the pasuk because I already have a kavachomer. Ha'atya le. We already derived it. Amar Rav Asher. Mishum dikal memar meikara dedina pircha. Rav Asher says actually because we're missing a step in the logic of the baraita. We brought a kavachomer, and then actually this kavachomer can be refuted from its very foundation. Mehecha kamaitit lea me'imo. Where are you learning it? From the fact that it says its mother. However, a goat and its mother, there is a prohibition there in that you're not allowed to slaughter the goat and its mother on the same day. However, that would not be true with goat meat and any cow or any sheep, because those are not its mothers, so there's no prohibition from slaughtering them on the same day, and therefore this undoes the kal vachomer, because actually there's a stringency when it comes to a goat and its mother in that they cannot be slaughtered on the same day, and you could say that's why you can also not cook them because of that stringency. But if it was a goat and some other species where it couldn't possibly be its mother because it's a different species, and then there's no prohibition of killing it on the same day as the other, so therefore I would say that this is less stringent and maybe it would be permitted to cook goat meat in milk of a different species. So since that kal vachomer actually does not work, Talmud lomar b'chalev imo, that's why I do need the pasuk, the second pasuk of lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, to include a cow and a sheep with meat from a goat and vice versa. Tanya idach, another baraita. B'chalev imo, en li ela b'chalev imo, b'chalev achoto gedola minayin. If I have only the pasuk in its mother's milk, I would say fine, only its mother. But what about a goat and its older sister? Right? We're trying to figure out how much to expand this pasuk and how much not to expand it. Giving us one example of goat and its mother's milk, but it doesn't mean only literally its mother's milk. So what about other species? Now we're asking, what about milk from other goats that's not its mother? How about its older sister? We're going to see younger sister in a second. Amarta kal vachomer. Uma imo shenechnesa imo ladir lehitaser nesra imo bebishul. We are going to derive this from a kal vachomer regarding a mother. We're assuming a case here where the mother and the offspring were born within the same fiscal year for tithing. Any animal that's born from Rosh Chodesh Tishrei until the next year, the day before Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, you have to give a tenth of those animals. You put them together and you pass them through a gate and you count 1, 2, 3, 9, and then the 10th one will be Maaser. And you have to give Maaser from animals that are born within the same year. So, and animals don't take so long to reach adulthood that they can have a child. It doesn't take 12 years like human beings, but rather even within a year, it can grow up. So you have this female that was born right after Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, and it grew up, and then it had a offspring by the end of the year. Good. So now those two, they can enter into the pen together to be tithed. So you see that they are very similar to each other. They're close to each other in that you can tithe one. If you tithe this one, it will cover the other one plus 8 others. 8 other animals that are born in the same year. And even though they can all be put in the pen together, yet you're not allowed to cook the meat of the offspring with its mother. So if so, achoto shelo nichnesa imo ladid lehitaser, you can imagine a case where you have an offspring and its older sister. So the sister is born more than a year before the offspring, and that cannot be placed in the pen together with its brother because they're born in different years. And odin shenesra imo bebishul, so all the more so, at least for that type of sister, one will not be allowed to cook it in its sister's milk. And so, at least for one case of a sister where it's more than a year older, we can learn from a kal vachomer, because the point is that the prohibition of the offspring and the mother applies through in all cases, including in a case where they're in the same year and they can be put in the pen together. And since they are very close together in that they can be put in the pen together, so they're very similar, and yet it's prohibited, so all the more so a sister that's a year older will also be prohibited. Talmud omar b'halev imo. And then, that's why it says b'halev imo. Here again, we must be missing a step, because if you already have a kal vachomer, why are you proving it from a pasuk? Why you need a pasuk that says a third time chalev imo to teach me, yes, even a sister? You just said we can prove it from a kal vachomer. Amar Rav Hashem mishum de'ikar lememar meikara dedina pircha mehecha kamaitit la meimo mali imo sheken nesra imo b'shchita tomar b'achoto gedola shelo nesra imo b'shchita, because we can refute this kal vachomer from the very foundation of it. Where are you learning the kal vachomer from? From its mother? Yeah, but its mother and the offspring are prohibited from slaughtering on the same day, and so therefore they're more prohibited. There's a stringency there. So therefore you cannot compare that to the older sister where there's no prohibition. You can kill two siblings of animal on the same day, an older sister and the younger brother. You can kill them on the same day, so they're more lenient, and since they're more lenient, maybe you're allowed to cook them together. That's why I do need b'halev imo to say no, even siblings, one is not permitted to cook them together. Ashkechan achoto gedola. Fine, I use that b'halev imo to teach me that I cannot cook goat meat with its older sister. Achoto ketana minayin. How about its younger sister? Atyami benaya. Oh, I can derive it from between them, meaning the combination of the mother prohibition and the older sister prohibition. Mehetete, how can I bring that? Wait, I can't do that because if I compare it to the mother, but the mother and the offspring is prohibited in shechita together, so that's a stringency. Maybe that's why there's a stringency of cooking them together. Okay, so we'll bring the older sister where there's no prohibition of killing them on the same day, and they'll prove that point is irrelevant. Yeah, but the older sister cannot be put in the pen together, so that's a stringency. But the mother will prove that is irrelevant because the mother is in the same year, and we're not talking about the same family. You can't be the mother is in the same year and the sister is older. We're talking about in general, in two different families, comparing them. So that will prove that each of these individual factors is not the cause of the stringency of meat and milk. And so therefore we see that the particulars in this case are not like that, and vice versa. What's the common denominator between the prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk and a kid in its older sister's milk? It's meat, and you can't cook it with milk. So too, I'll include the case of the younger sister. You have the meat, and then you have the milk of the younger sister animal, and therefore, and that must be also prohibited, because it makes no difference the fact that you can't slaughter the offspring and the mother on the same day. That's not the critical factor. It makes no difference that you cannot put the two in the pen together, the older sister. That's not the critical point, but the common denominator shows that milk and meat, and therefore that will include the younger sister too. Wait, once you have this, you're just saying in anything that's meat and milk, you are not allowed to cook together. In fact, the older sister we can derive also. We're just saying meat and milk. So because the particulars of the fact that you can't slaughter these two together, you can't put them in the pen together, make no difference. So then I don't need an extra pasuk to tell me that meat and its older sister you cannot cook together. I can figure that out from this common denominator. You're right, I could. Okay, so now what am I going to do with the third halev imo? I only know that I cannot cook an animal and its mother's milk, or as we just said, an animal in some other, and its older sister and younger sister's milk is also prohibited. But what about in its own milk? If I have an animal and I milk the animal, so I got it out. We're not talking about that's in the udder. In the udder, we already talked about is not such a problem. But if you milk this goat, and now you have the milk, and then you slaughter it, and then you cook it in its own milk. Well, how do I know that that's prohibited? Amarta kal v'chomer, u'ma b'makom shelo ne'esar peri'im peri b'shchita, ne'esar peri'im ha'em b'shchita. We can learn the prohibition of cooking an animal in its own milk from a kal v'chomer. If in the situation of peri, that's siblings, there is no prohibition of shechita, you're allowed to slaughter two siblings together on the same day, and yet ne'esar, one is prohibited from slaughtering the mother and the offspring on the same day. So here we see that mother and offspring relationship is more stringent than sibling relationship. If so, then makom shene'esar peri im peri bebishul, in a situation when one is not allowed to cook two offspring together. Here the two offspring is not talking about siblings, but rather one peri is the child of the mother, the kid, and the other peri is referring to the milk. The milk is also a production of, produce of the mother. So the mother produces two things, an offspring animal, which is the meat, and it produces the milk. And in that case, those are definitely prohibited. That's the basic law of the pasuk, lo teveshel gedi b'halev imo, and that is peri, and that is prohibited. So, if in a situation where two offspring are permitted to do shechita together, and yet the parent and child you're not allowed, so if a situation where the two so-called siblings, it's the meat and the milk of the mother, are prohibited to cook together, and odin shenesar peri im ha'em bebishul, all the more so we will not be allowed to cook the peri here. That's the milk of the mother animal with the animal herself, because that would be a parent-child relationship. So regarding cooking, the sibling relationship, which in this case is actually not two siblings, but the meat, the offspring of the kid, and the milk of the mother, which is its kind of offspring, it's its fruit. If that's prohibited, all the more so the parent-child, which in this case is referring to the mother and the milk, is going to be prohibited with itself. Talmud lomar b'halev imo. And then it brings a pasuk that we learn this also from a pasuk b'halev imo, the extra pasuk. Halamali kira. Wait, why do I need this pasuk? Ha'atyala. We already cited a kal v'chomer. What's wrong with this kal v'chomer? Amar Rav Achteboy bar Ameh. We're going to have a few different solutions to what's wrong with this kal v'chomer. Mishum de'ikal memar. Sus ben susya achi perda yochiach. She'asur peri im peri, umutar peri im ha'em. We're now going to compare it to a different case really altogether, where you have siblings and parent-child relationship, where it's the opposite of the basis of this kal v'chomer. Because here, if you have a horse and a male horse and a female horse give mate and produce a horse, 100% horse. And also, that mother mates with a donkey and produces a mule. So this horse and the mule are half siblings. Okay, in that case, the peri in peri, the horse offspring, you're not allowed to mate with the mule sister, half sister, because those are two different species. and yet one is permitted to mate the horse offspring with its own mother. There's no problem of incest when it comes to animals, and they are the same species. The horse and the mother are both 100% horses. And so here you see the opposite of the basis of this Kal Vachomer. You said regarding Shechita, we see that two offspring is permitted and the parent-child is more stringent than two siblings. Okay, that's true for Shechita, but it's the opposite here where the two siblings are prohibited and it's the parent-child that is permitted, and therefore that ruins the basis of this Kal Vachomer, and that's why we need the pasuk. But we say actually no, because the animal case is completely different. Hatam zera'av hu dekagarim. You know why the horse and its half-sister mule are not allowed to be together? It has nothing to do with the mother. It only has to do with the father, because the horse's father is a horse. Well, it's actually both, because both of his parents are a horse. But if you would imagine a case where the parents are the same, so here's the other case: Taha pered ben susya achi pered yochiach. Let's say you have a horse and a donkey, and they give birth to two mules. Mules can be male or female. Well, in that case, shemutar peri im peri, the two mules would be permitted to each other. The male mule and the female mule that are full siblings are permitted to each other because they're the same species. Two mules are permitted to each other. Vasur peri im ha'em, even though that male mule, you're not allowed to mate with its mother because its mother is 100% donkey and this offspring is a half-half. And so you see that the reason why in the case above, the horse is not allowed to be with its half-sister mule is not simply because of the mother, it's actually because of the father, because in this case, where they have the same mother and father, then but both of them have the same mother and father, then both offsprings are mules, well then the siblings are prohibited from each other. So the fact that the siblings are permitted to each other here is not relevant to the mother-child relationship, and therefore you cannot compare this case to our case, and therefore this is not a reason to reject the Kal Vachomer. So now we need a different reason to reject the Kal Vachomer in order to show why we need the pasuk. So now we try with siblings and parents and mothers that have to do with slaves. A Canaanite slave has some of the laws of a Jew until they are freed, and then they have a full law of a Jew. Now, Canaanite slaves are allowed to be with each other. They're allowed to mate each other while they're Canaanite slaves, and that's true even for close relations. The laws of incest do not apply there. However, once a Canaanite slave is freed, then they become a full Jew, and they are not allowed to mate with a Canaanite slave. Now, Ela Amar Mor Bered Ravina Mishum Deika Lememar. So Mor, the son of Ravina, says, I will challenge the Kal Vachomer based on this case. Mishum Deika Lememar. Eved ben Shifha Achi Meshuchreret Yochiach. If you have an Eved Kanaani who is the offspring of a Shifcha Kanaanit, and this Eved also has a sister. So you have, in other words, a Shifcha Kanaanit that has a son and a daughter, and they're all Canaanite slaves. But then the sister, she goes free. So the sister is a full Jew. Shasur peri im peri. Now those two children, the brother and the sister, are prohibited from each other because the brother is a Canaanite slave and the sister is free, and therefore she's a full Jew. So they are not allowed to be with each other. And yet, mutar peri im ha'em, that son is permitted to be with his own mother because laws of incest do not apply here because we don't consider relations among slaves to be significant. And here is the opposite case of the basis of the Kal Vachomer above, where regarding Shechita, siblings are permitted and the parents are prohibited. So we assume that means that the parent offspring relation is always going to be more stringent than siblings, but here it's the other way around. So that challenges the Kal Vachomer. However, hatam get shichrur hu de kagarim. No, it's not the fact that they're siblings that makes it prohibited, but rather the fact that the sister got a bill of manumission that went free. Now she is a full Jew. That's why she's prohibited from being with any Canaanite slave. Doesn't matter what the relationship is. And you can prove this from a case of a man who's a slave, who's the son of a woman who went free, and he is the brother of a shivcha. In other words, here you have the same thing of a Canaanite slave that gives birth to a son and a daughter, and then now it's the mother that goes free. Shemutar peri im peri. Now the son and the daughter, although they're siblings, they are Canaanite slaves. So the laws of incest don't apply there. They're allowed to be with each other. Vasur peri imahem, even though the son is prohibited from being with his mother, but that's because his mother is freed. So you see, this law has entirely to do with who is free and therefore a full Jew and who is a slave. That's the law. It makes no difference regarding who is a sibling and who is a parent, and therefore also this is not going to be relevant to our case and is not a way to undo the kal vachomer. So we need yet another reason to undo the kal vachomer. Ela amar Rav Idi bar Avin mishum deika lememar kil'e zira'im yochichu she'asur peri im peri mutar peri im ha'em. Rav Idi bar Avin says, I have another way to reject the basis of that kal vachomer, because you can say that planting diverse kinds of species of grains will be the proof, where one fruit with another fruit, like wheat and barley, are prohibited to plant together, and yet mutar peri im ha'em. The em here is the ground. The ground is like the mother that produces the grain, and you're permitted to put wheat in the ground, or separately you could put barley in the ground. So the ground, which is the mother, is permitted with wheat. It's also permitted with barley. And yet wheat and barley together are prohibited. So here is an example that undoes the basis of the kal vachomer, because here its two siblings are prohibited, and yet the parent and mother and child are permitted. But we reject that. Kilum nesar peri im peri ela al yedehaem tachite v'sare bekada la mitseru. But in this case, the fruit and the fruit are prohibited only because of the mother. It's only when you plant the wheat and the barley in the ground that is what makes them prohibited. If you take wheat and barley and you put them in the jug together, that's okay, because they're not growing, just sitting in a jug together. That's okay. So as siblings can be together, it's only when they are both with the mother, that's when there's a prohibition. So since the prohibition of the siblings is only because they are both with the mother in the ground, so this is not a good example, and we need yet another way to undo the kal vachomer. Ela marav Hashem mishum deika lememar ma lifri im peri sheken shene gufim toma bifri im ha'em sheken guf echad mishum hachi istirich kera. Rav Hashem doesn't compare the original kal vachomer to anything else. He just undoes the kal vachomer itself, and he says when we brought that original kal vachomer, we said peri im peri. That's talking about when you have a mother animal, and one peri is its offspring, the other peri is its milk. But the offspring and the milk are two separate bodies. It gave birth to the offspring, one day, and then later on it made some milk. So these are two independent bodies, and therefore it makes sense that those two things should be prohibited. Whereas peri im ha'em, the peri, which is the milk of the mother, with the mother itself, those are one body. And so there's less of a reason to prohibit the two things that are actually one body. This is more like it's a part of the mother. And so I wouldn't know that the mother would be prohibited to cook in its own milk based on a kal vachomer, because the kal vachomer is assuming two things that are separate bodies. the milk of the mother and the offspring of the mother, whereas the milk of the mother and the mother itself are one body, and certainly if it's inside the udder, there's no prohibition. So now it's outside the udder, but still we might think logically it will be more lenient than an offspring, an animal, and the milk, which are two different bodies, where there's more reason to say these are two different things, and therefore it's meat and one's milk is prohibited. But based on just logic alone, the mother and its own milk are one body and may be permitted based on logic. And finally, we understand why we needed the pasuk. The truth is that this kal v'chomer from the beginning was pretty strange by calling the piri, the milk, is the offspring, is the fruit of it, of the mother, was a curious thing, and that's what Rav Ashi is challenging. But I think this was an exercise that the Gemara went through in order to bring different cases of places where you have offspring that has one relationship, whereas siblings have a different relationship, and you can see it all in all different ways regarding slaves, regarding animals, regarding grains, and by comparing them, it's a very fruitful intellectual exercise in order to recognize the similarities and the differences between these various areas of halacha. Amar Rav Ashi, minayin lebasar bechalav she'asur be'achila? Rav Ashi asks, how do you know that meat and milk that were cooked together, one is prohibited from eating it? After all, the pasuk says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. So there is another derasha that's repeated 3 times, once for cooking, once for eating, and once for getting benefit from. But Rav Ashi is deriving it in a different way. So how do you know that you cannot eat meat and milk together? Shene'emar lo tochal kol to'eva kol sheti'abti lecha harehu bebal tochal. Because a different pasuk that says, do not eat anything abominable. And that teaches that anything that Hashem says is abominable, and that is cooking. Hashem says, don't cook the meat and milk. So therefore, if Hashem says, don't cook it, and then you go and cook it, no, Hashem says that's abominable, that's a to'eva, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it either, because Hashem doesn't like this. You violated a prohibition by cooking it, and so therefore you're not going to be allowed to eat it. But the point is that the derivation is from this pasuk lo tochal kol to'eva, not from lo tevashel. Because lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo prohibits cooking it, then this pasuk is a follow-up and says, if you cooked it, well, then it is abominable and therefore prohibited from eating. So I know that you can't eat it. How do you know you can't get benefit from it? כדרבי אבהוד, אמר רבי אבו, אמר רבי אלעזר, כל מקום שנאמר לא יאכל, לא תאכל, לא תאכלו, אחד איסור אכילה, ואחד איסור הנאה במשמע, עד שיפרוט לך, כתוב כדרך שפרט לך בנבלה, לגר בנתינה, ולגוי במכירה. Rabbi Abu explains in the name of Rabbi Elazar, anytime the Torah says don't eat something, it doesn't matter what language it uses, whether it says lo yochal, lo tochal, third person singular, second person plural, doesn't matter. Whether that means, even though it only says don't eat it, it means you cannot eat it and you cannot get benefit from it. That's true in all places, unless the pasuk goes out of its way to say that you can get benefit from it, as the pasuk does so regarding a nevela. The pasuk in nevela, we're about to read it, says, Lo tochilu kol nevela, lager asher bisharecha, titenena va'achala, o machor lenochri. It says, if you have a nevela animal, then don't eat it, but you can give it or sell it to others that are not Jewish. And so, since the pasuk there says you can give it, you can sell it, so in that case, you can get benefit from it. Like either give it to a ged or sell it to a non-Jew, as we're about to see. And so there, the pasuk goes out of its way to say you can't eat it, but you can get benefit. But if it doesn't say an exception, then the assumption is you cannot sell it or give it away. You cannot get benefit from it. So that's a very interesting rule. Anything that you cannot eat, you cannot get benefit from unless the pasuk says otherwise. De tanya lo tochilu kol nevela. Do not eat a nevela animal. Lager asher bisharecha titenena va'achala. You should give it as a gift to a ger. A ger is a resident alien. a non-Jew who is living amongst you in your cities, bisharecha, and generally they are poor, they don't have land, it's hard for them to get adjusted, they're immigrants, and so therefore give it to them so that they can eat it. But they didn't convert, so they're not Jewish, so they're allowed to eat it. Or sell it to a nochri, machor le-nochri. The nochri is a foreigner. He happens to be in town, maybe he's passing through, a merchant, and that person you can sell it to because you're not obligated to take care of the nochri. He can take care of himself. He's here, he's doing business. If he doesn't like it here, he goes back home. But the ger is an immigrant who's came to stay, and they are in need. So then you have a higher obligation to a ger than to a nochri. And the ela lager benitina v'lago b'mechira. Lager b'mechira minayin tamod omar lager netitinena o machor. However, let's say you want to do the other way around. So I know that you can give it to a ger, or you can sell it to a nochri, to a total non-Jew. Like ger, how about if you want to sell it to a ger? Okay, it's true, it's nice to give a tzedakah, but let's say I don't want to. I want to sell it to a ger and he wants to buy it. Is it permitted to do that? Yes, because you can also break up the pasuk differently. You can say, Lo tochilu kol nevela, la ger asher bisharecha titenena v'achala o machor. Period. And forget the last word. So it says you can give it to him or sell it to him. And therefore, yes, you're allowed to sell it to a ger. Like goy benitina minayin. Now what if I want to give it to a gift? As a gift to a goy, can I? Talmud omar titenena o machol le-nochri. Yes, because I can also put the comma over here. I could put like ger, asher bisharecha, comma. I could start here. Titenena v'achala o machol le-nochri. I can give it or sell it to a nochri. Nimsa, echad goy v'echad ger v'echad goy, ben b'mechira, ben b'metina, dibred b'meir. According to the b'meir, this pasuk is mixing and matching and saying you can give it or sell it to a resident alien or to a foreigner, and that both ways are okay. Rabbi Yehuda omer devarim kichtavan, lager b'netina lagoy b'mechira. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Meir's reading of that pasuk and says, no, you have to read it exactly as the punctuation indicates, which is lager asher b'sharecha titanena v'achala. You have two choices. Either give it as a gift to the ger, you're obligated to him, he's needy, he lives with you, and so give it to him as a gift. Or, if you want to sell it, then you sell it to a nochri, but you can't do it the other way around. My tamad Rabbi Yehuda. What is Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning? He says, if you're going to punctuate it as Rabbi Meir did, if the pasuk comes to teach you the way Rabbi Meir that you can mix and match, then it should have been written differently. Lichtob lachamana lo tochelu kol nebela lager asher bisharecha titenena v'achala umachor. It should have said, do not eat any nebela. For the ger that's in your gates, you can give it and to eat it, or you can sell it. O lamali, you wouldn't need the word o in between, right? And the pasuk actually says the word o, titenena v'achala o machor, either this or that. So the or breaks it up such that it's the ger that you're giving it to, or the selling it to the nochri. But if you wanted to mix and match like Rabbi Meir did and read it both ways, then why would you put the word or in there? So the fact that there is the word or, shema amina lidvarim kichtavan hu de'ata lager b'netina v'lagor b'mechira. You see, it's clearly separating the two, and you have a choice: either give it as a gift to a ger or sell it to a goy. Rabbi Meir amar chai or le'hakadim netina deger de'mechira de'nochri. And Rabbi Meir would say, no, I can read it both ways, and I'll tell you why there's the word or in there, and that is that you should prefer giving it as a gift to a ger rather than selling it to a goy. If there's no ger around or whatever, you need the money, okay, fine. Second best, you can give it to a goy. Now, so you can read it as he did, and put in punctuation earlier or later so that you can mix and match. You can do it either way. But the word "o" is there to say that the the best thing to do is to give it as a gift to a ger. Rabbi Yehuda would also agree that it's better to give it to a ger, to give tzedakah, rather than sell it. However, I don't need the word "o" for that. Because the ger, there's a mitzvah that you have to sustain him, you have to help him out. So it's based on that mitzvah. You already know that if you can do a mitzvah, you can, and there's a ger there, and he's hungry. Obviously, that is going to take precedence because of the general mitzvah to sustain a ger. Whereas the nochri, the foreigner who's just passing through, you are not obligated to sustain, and therefore, even without the word "o," I know that I should prefer to help out and give tzedakah to the ger. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.